Okay. So, and let me share my screen. Good morning. Good morning. So the Rav Shulchan Aruch had told us that you're not over on the mitzvahs lo saseh unless the worker has asked for his wages. And as the Imrei Yaakov said, you're still over on the aseh, you're still over on the positive commandment, even if he doesn't ask for his wages. And he furthermore said that he doesn't have to ask explicitly, but if it's implicit, but if the worker just simply shows up to get compensation, I mean, he just shows up and says, I finished my work, and he appears before the employer, so that in itself, he doesn't have to say explicitly. Okay, so let's take a look at the Biurim. Hachafetz Chaim be'ahavas chesed perak tes seif yud aleph kasa v'zel lashona. The Sefer Ahavas Chesed it covers a number of different topics, but it definitely discusses a number of topics having to do with the mitzvah of Chesed and financial propriety. He says, "V'cheinim socher etzlo behema v'kelim lihishtamesh bahem litzrachav." That if a person rented an animal or utensils to use for his needs, v'kalu pulasan etzlo, and he's finished the work, he's finished using them. Sarach lizaher l'shalem demei schirasan bizmano, afilu lo tava'o ba'al habehema v'hakelim. You have to be very careful to pay for the rental at the end of the rental period, immediately after the rental period, even if the owner has not requested payment. De'ein raya midolot teva'o, demarsheu la'acher et hazman, acharei shelo yada shekala pulaso ma'yitva'oso. He says the fact that he hasn't yet asked for payment yet could be because he's not even aware that you no longer need the object. And that's why he's not asking for it back. So that's the quote from the Chafetz Chaim. Uvinesiv HaChesed Sham, so the commentary called the Nesiv HaChesed, I don't know whether the Chafetz Chaim himself wrote that or whether it was written by one of his students. Kasav Hatam de Bo'inan Sheyehei Raya Shahasachir Mitratzeh Mida'ato. And he says, and the reason why the Chafetz Chaim requires you to pay him is because you need to know for certain that the worker is willing to forego the payment. You can't assume that because the worker hasn't asked explicitly for payment, that means he's foregone the payment immediately. It's only if he says explicitly, you know what, pay me tomorrow, it's totally okay. V'chein le'el b'sifkat lamed beis kasav kein ze v'zoloshono v'nira dehu adin keshira lahapoel eza ones achar shekola pu'ulaso she'eno yachol lavo lebeis balabayis achar ma'osav v'lo lishloach shliach etzlo. He writes that when you have someone working for you and they finish the work, if for whatever reason they can't come to the balabayis to collect payment afterwards, tzarech hamaskir laholich hamos etzlo, then the employer has a legal obligation to get the money to him. The chol ikar hasfara de below tavo hasacher eino over balabais below tolin umishum de mistama midas hasacher hu shemisratzelazeh. He says because the only time that we say that if the worker hasn't demanded payment, the employer is not in violation of bal tolin of spending payment, is only because we know that the worker has basically been willing to forgive it. But over here, let's say he can't come to get his payment because there was a rainstorm or something happened that forced him to run home before he could stop off at the employer's house to collect payment. You don't see from the fact that he didn't show up to get his check that he doesn't want payment right away. So he's now going to elaborate on this point in the Chafetz Chaim. But the main thing that I wanted us to see is that if you're not sure whether the worker wants his payment or not, you can't assume, well, he didn't ask me for a check, he didn't ask me for payment, so I'm not over on Bal Tolin. The default position is that you are over on Bal Tolin unless you know explicitly that the worker is willing to forego the payment. Okay. And he says that perhaps there's room to deliberate on this issue.
You're allowed to ask him whether he's willing, or you have to wait for him to say.
I think that's a valid question. I was thinking that, look, I don't think there's anything wrong with initiating the suggestion. Look, it's really not convenient for me to pay you now, but if you want the money, I have it, and I'll give it to you. But it would be so much easier if we could do this tomorrow. Do you mind? I don't think there's anything wrong with that. If you ask him, you have to gauge, if he willingly says it's totally okay, you can wait until tomorrow, then that's fine. But what if you see a little bit of a grimace, right? And then he says, okay. So then it could be that with Dioraisa, you're still over, even though he explicitly said it's okay. It could be they said it's okay because they want to get the job next time also, but they're not really happy. So.
Go on to say anything negative
to the employer. That's right. Okay. Okay. So now let's go on to the next. We had also seen we had seen the previous Imrei Yaakov. Okay, let's see. So the next thing that we saw is that I'm not in violation if at the time that payment is due, I don't have money. He says, Lo tava o hasachir, if the worker has not requested payment, o shetava o ve'en lo mos litein lo, or he's requested payment and the employer simply doesn't have the money at that moment, afilu yesh lo metaltal in harbe, even if he has a lot of chattel, you're still not in violation of this prohibition. Just scroll down a little bit. Or if you deposit the money to a third party to give to the employee whenever he asks for it, then in all of those cases, you're not in violation. So apparently, even if I have assets, but they're not in cash form, then I'm not in violation of Bal Tolin. So the Imrei Yaakov says, "Ve'en lo mos, va'af shahaya lo biyom shesicharo, kevin shebeis gemar malacha ein lo eino over." Even if the fellow had cash at the time that he hired the employee, the fact that he doesn't have it when the job is finished means that he's not in violation, which would be the reasonable thing. In other words, when I hired you, I thought I had the money to pay you. And that's the reason why, in good conscience, I could hire you. But for whatever reason, something happened and now I don't have the money. Yeah, right. And then he said, Afilu yeshlo metaltalin, mashmos harab da'afshi yeshlo kol davar acher, eno over. It seems like no matter what I have, as long as I don't have cash, I'm not in violation. Rak im yeshlo mos. Aval b'shita mekubetzes, but then he quotes from the shita mekubetzes, kasav b'shem haritva, V'im yesh lo ochelin dekaimi lo mechira. Shita Mekubetzis is one of the medievalists, and he writes that if the employer has food, which can be easily converted into cash, ugam kein bichlal itach. Let's say the employer owns a market, and he has all different kinds of consumable goods. He says that is also considered to be tantamount to cash because it's easily sellable. The harayachol mochram. Chein mashma b'sefer hachinuch mitzvah tavkuf peches v'achapetz chaim kosav dim yachol lahasig mos lilvos tzarich lilvos kadei sheyir yachol l'kay mitzvahs asay b'yom titein schara. So that's number one. If I have consumable goods that are ready, that are retail, that are for sale, then that counts as cash, and I have to use that in order to pay him, as long as he's willing to accept payment from that. And then the Chafetz Chaim also writes that if a person has the ability to borrow money in order to pay his worker, he's obligated to borrow in order to pay his worker on time. Ubifrat im hasachir ani. And the Chafetz Chaim emphasizes this is particularly true if the worker is poor, meaning that if he doesn't get paid on time, he's going to be out of pocket. He'll have to ask other people for a loan or for tzedakah in order to have his next meal. But from the words of the Rav Shulchan Aruch that we'll see shortly, it sounds like that's a virtuous thing to do, but it's not my halachic obligation. It's an act of chassidus. It's an act of piety to borrow money in order to pay my employees.
Yeah, that would be a big finish. No matter these, whatever hard assets he has, you usually borrow money on those, land or whatever. So that would then open it up in all circumstances.
Yeah, right. The in the Likutin he writes, let's say at the end of the job, the employee asks for payment. The employer doesn't have the cash at that time. But then later in that evening, the employer does get the cash. So he's not yet past the time limit for Biyomot Titain Scharo. So Mechuyev Laholich Lo Hamos O Lahodio Sheyavo V'Yitel Mosav. At that point, you're obligated to bring him the cash at that moment, or to at least let him know that they're available for pickup. The Ein Lo Mos, if the Balabayas does not have money, the Achar Shenishlam Pulas HaSachir Yesh Lo Labal Habayas. Let's see. Lizaher shelo yotzi ma'osav lischora k'sheyodea shal yedei ze lo yeh lo achar kach b'mela shalem l'sachir. He says any employer has to be careful not to deplete his cash supply if he knows that he's going to have to pay his employee. In other words, you're right, Paul? This is what was bothering you. You're not allowed to knowingly deplete your cash supply. If I've already hired this guy and I know he's going to charge me $100 at the end of the job, I have to make sure I have $100 cash, right? It's like, hiring someone and not knowing that you have the ability to pay them is an irresponsible thing to do. Even if the employee hasn't asked him. The kol shekain lahotzi mosav lischora acher lischora achar shetivao de bevadai aser. And that's certainly true, that if after the guy finishes the job, in the interim, you go ahead and use this money for some other purpose, whether a business enterprise or some purchases. He says that's also you're in violation when the guy comes and you say, I'm sorry, I don't have cash. Well, he says that's even a Torah violation. He says, Afilu kodem shenishlam pulata sachir, and it's proper for every thinking individual to be careful with this and to make sure that he doesn't he's not derelict in this responsibility. So it sounds like from the way that he's written this, if I end up blowing the cash, or I end up using up the cash while the guy is still working, I'm not necessarily I'm not transgressing a Torah violation by not having the money on time. But it's certainly not a moral thing to do. If I had the cash at the time when the job was done and then I blow it by spending it on something before the guy comes to collect his payment, then I've actually been over on the biblical commandment of paying him in the proper time. Im socher shnei poalim v'yesh lo maos rak avor ha'echad. Let's say I have two people working for me. I got the plumber and the electrician both working. They both finish the job at the same time, and I've only got enough to pay one of them and not the other. Nira diachalik mashiesh lo lishnehem vein over bevaltolin acharei shein lo yoter. He says, split it. Pay partial payments to each one, and when you run out of money, you're not over on bal ta'acher anymore, right? The im echad mehem ani ha'ani kodem. But that's provided that everything is equal as far as the employees. What if one of the employees has his own money in the bank and the other employee is poor? So then you would have to give the money to the poor person, because you know that if you don't pay him the full amount, he may go hungry. I think that might be a factor also. You might have to prorate it, perhaps. I'm not sure. Yeah, well, if one of them says, "Don't worry, you can pay me next week," so then he's been moichel, and then you're certainly not over. Okay, so now in the biurim over here, he asks the following question: B'yesh la'ayed ba'hadin heicha sheyesh lo dolarim ve'en lo shkalim. Okay, so you're dealing with a case in Eretz Yisrael. The employer has dollars in cash, but he doesn't have shekels in cash. So, which is sometimes a very common thing. I've only got foreign currency to pay you. Ha'imhu over al baltolin. He says, can he legitimately say, I don't have the cash to pay you? So, the dollar mikriteri le'inyan sa b'sa, the kaimalan the aser lilvos sa'a b'sa'a. He says, we've established in another place that a foreign currency is considered like produce and not the cash itself. In other words, the Gemara says that you're not allowed to borrow a cup of sugar with the promise to pay back a cup of sugar if the market in sugar fluctuates dramatically, because that may be a problem of ribis. So if, let's say, a cup of sugar today is worth $1, and next week a cup of sugar is worth $2, by giving you back a cup of sugar after a week, I've actually paid you back a loan with interest. That's the whole point. That's the whole point of the Gemara over there. Right, yeah. So, but he says the whole derov hameschar azul bishkolim habalei hadola legabav kiperi. So then, in one respect, foreign currency like dollars in Israel is considered not cash, but rather a commodity, and not cash itself. And we learned over here that if there's a commodity, the employer has commodities, but he doesn't have cash. Technically, he can say, I'm putter from paying you. The afilu matbeya zahav legabe kesef dino kaperi klapi mekuchu memkar beribis ayin shambaritva, etc., etc., etc. He says that even gold coins, if they're not regularly used on the market, because people regularly use silver coins, so then gold is also considered to be a commodity and not cash. Umuchach mehasim b'chol matbeya afilu hu yotzei b'hotza mikol makam hol ve'ino charif kol kach ve'in rov hamekach umemkar nasa imo habalei kepera. And it turns out from that previous discussion that any currency, that even if some people use it, but it's not the regular currency for that market, or like, US dollars in Canada might be of the same category. Yes, if some people will accept it for payment, but a lot of people will say, we're in Canada, what are you paying me with US dollars? So there was, that's right. There's this guy, Dave Portnoy, who does pizza reviews. I don't know if anyone is familiar with that. My kids showed me this, and he's very famous among the young people. What he does is he happens to be Jewish, but he's not religious at all. He basically does pizza reviews of different pizzas, just regular margarita pizzas. He'll just walk into a store that is different cities, and he says, one bite, everyone knows the rules, and he'll take 5 or 6 bites. It's a running joke, and he'll give it a 5.7, 8.9, whatever it is. So he was just in Toronto. He came to Canada for the first time, and he said, everyone told me you can't get a decent slice of pizza in Toronto. He says, it's not true. There's good pizza here also. So no. So anyway, you should feel proud of your city. So anyway, but he made a joke that he was offering dollars to one of the shops. They weren't interested. He said, I was offering the same amount that they were asking Canadians. He says, I was offering them 25% more, but they still didn't want to take it. That's what I just remembered from this. But anyway, so yes, there are going to be some people who will accept it, but there are some people who won't accept it. He says, "Umikol makom elo anogin lilvos dolarim yeshlam malismoch mikametamim." He says, if a person makes a loan in dollars in Israel, this becomes somewhat problematic, because let's say the exchange rate for dollars in Israel fluctuates, and he's writing this in the 80s when the shekel, there was inflation in Israel at a higher rate than inflation in the US. It's actually the opposite today, where there's more inflation on the dollar than there is on the shekel today. So today you don't have to worry about it. But let's say when the exchange rate was constantly where the shekel was being devalued. So if I lend you $100 today and you pay me that same $100 next week, the $100 that I lent you today may be worth 5 shekels or 500 shekels, and let's say 300 shekels. And then when you pay me back $100 next week, it's worth 350 shekels or 400 shekels. So that could be a question of paying back a loan with interest. But he says there are heterim that you can rely on. Ulam nachon yoter sheyelolo v'lechol hapachos dolar echad da'ashari b'li pikpuk. He says it's proper for the borrower to have $1 on him when he borrows the money, because then he's demonstrated that for him it's considered to be currency and not a commodity. No, you're not over on ribis if it's the actual cash standard of that place. Yes, it could. He says it could potentially be a problem halachically, but there are heterim that you can rely on. Yeah. Because that's not the currency of the country. Yeah. But, it's certainly not ribis de oraisa. And whether it or not it's ribis de rabbanan is deliberated upon by the poskim.
It's easily liquid. You can pay in tomatoes and apples.
Yeah, so I think that he's probably going to get to that destination in this discussion. If something is so liquid that it's easily converted into cash, then maybe it has the same status as cash. So again, the question is, what is my obligation? Here, the question is, if I only have dollars and I don't have shekels and payment is due, can I say, I'm sorry, I have no cash? I only have cash equivalents. He says, so this din, the din of using foreign currency in loans is only a rabbinic prohibition. That the rabbis looked at foreign currency as if it is a commodity and not currency itself. But what will be the halacha for our purposes? Do we look at it as cash, liquid cash, or not? V'nira de l'shitas magid mishnah v'chein pasuk atur b'shulchan aruch da'afilu im yesh lo shava kesus u'v'metaltalin de'ina over al baltalin u'chmoshe kasuf kan harav l'fi shita zu gam im yesh lo dolarim eino oiver. And it says, it seems to me that you're not in violation if all you have is dollars. And the reason he says that he feels that way, da'ayin lekaman bibiurim divramasul scharo umos the mavur sham the yisod hadavar da'afim islay lebalabayis metalton mikamakam eno over. He says, what's the whole rationale that I'm not in violation if I have commodities and I don't have cash? Umishum dechayvu latet lepol dafka maos mezumanim shaldas kein hu niskar. He says, because when the employee agreed to do the job, it was because he assumed he was getting paid in cash and not getting paid in cash equivalents. Behold, ve'ein lo mezumanim mamash, hagam deyesh lo metaltal v'yachol macham lasos mehem mezumanim, mikol makom le'inyan baltalin eino over, demukri ein lo ayin sham v'tavin. He says, but the fact that the employer now does not have cash, and that was the expectation of the employee, he wasn't expecting anything else. Therefore, the employer is not in violation if he doesn't have what the employee was expecting. And if that's the argument, if that's the rationale, then it would seem, he says, that it's no different over here. Agam dieshlo dolarim mikol makom kishapol niskala balabayis vaday dedato hayulakabel shkalim. He says, when an employee agrees to take on a job, it's the expectation implicitly is to get paid in shekels, not to get paid in dollars. Shehem hamos sheyotzim beretz Yisrael b'chol makom, because that's the readily usable currency in the land of Israel. Now, of course, understanding this rationale, it's clear that if you're working in an industry where people are paid in dollars, because there could be certain, let's say working for a foreign company. I'm working for a US-based company, and they give me the option. Would you like to get paid in shekels or would you like to get paid in dollars? And a person who's a dual national might have a bank account, a US bank account, and he might have an Israeli bank account. Just like I'm a dual national and I have a Canadian account and I have a US account, right? He says, whereas dollars in Israel are not readily usable in all places. You can't go to the Makolet or you can't go to Supersol and pay in dollars at the cashier. And therefore, the obligation of the employer doesn't have the option of paying dollars to an employee if the employee doesn't want the dollars. Umemela, Kevin de'enlo karega shkalim hagam deishlo dolarim avalei kishar metaltalin dekaimelam b'shulchan aruch deina over chmoshe kasuf harav. And therefore, it's like any other commodity, which is not cash itself, and therefore you're not in violation. Va'afilu lefi masha kasuf avas chesed. The imieshel l'balabayis matbeya gedola shemechuyev lifrot osakidei l'shalim lahasachir bismano mikol makom adayin leka mizeraya l'nidon didan. He says, even according to the Chafetz Chaim that we learned just a few minutes ago, who said that if you have big cash you owe, let's say all I have is $100 bill. We learned this on Friday. If the employer only has $100 bill and he owes the employee $20, he can't say, I'm sorry, I don't have it. He's got to go change the $100 bill. He says the shiny hussam, so maybe make the same argument. The Balabayas has an obligation to change the dollars into shekels. He says, no. Shiny hussam, demari deyeshlam yosu sug matbea sheyotze be'osa medina. He says, but there it's different because the guy has currency. Amnam kol masha kasavnu hurak l'das hamagid mishna shar poskim da'az libishitze kanal. Avalafi masha hevenu b'imrei Yaakov das ashita mekubetzes b'shem aritva. But everything that I've written is a heter only according to the Magid Mishnah and others like him who say that you only are obligated to pay if you have actual currency. But I previously quoted in the Shita Mekubetzis, which we just learned a few minutes ago, that the Svirle de Gamim Enlo Mizumonim Rak Ochlim de Kamila Mechiru Gamkin Bichlal Itach. He says, but according to that, if I have commodities that are readily sellable and are meant for sale, then that is also considered that I have cash, because they're very then certainly dollars would be no different from canned tomatoes that I have for sale. The efshir the adifa mine, and it could be that it's even better, more analogous to cash. ולכן למעשה ודאי רואי לחוש לשיטתם ולפיכך אם הפועל אינו משרץ לקבלת הדולרים צריך הבעל הבית לפרט משלם לו שכר בשקלים כפי מה שמגיע לו. And therefore, if all I have is dollars and the employee doesn't want to accept dollars, I then have an obligation to convert it into shekels. Okay, we'll hold it here for today.